and gentlemen, boys and girls, and doctors, I want to thank you for joining us today. We're going to talk on a topic that is, well, it may surprise you a little bit. Now, typically in doctor demographics, we go through the locations that are showing significant growth or really catastrophic shrinkage in the population. Or we'll discuss the demographic character of a particular group of people and talk about how viable they are or desirable they might be as a patient base, or maybe not. But today we're going to be dealing with a topic that demographers are talking a lot about between themselves, and that is the rise of the lonely. Now, there are reasons why we discuss median household size. In other words, how many people live per household. You know that the more people who live in a household, the more effective your advertising or promotion is going to be. Because if you have, for instance, a large number of potential patients within an area, in a household, that makes it a particularly desirable place to go. Or if you know that you're going to make a lot more money by serving one or more members of a household, that makes it a desirable place to promote. I got that. But today we're going to talk about something that's a little bit the opposite of that. We're going to talk about what we call the rise of the lonely. Now, much of the initial research started with what's going on in Asia. And you may not recognize it, but Asia's got some issues that are something they don't particularly want to talk about, but it's still true. Here's what it is. Society is changing. It's changing all over the place. People are living alone at a much greater number and rate in America than any previous time in our history. It was desirable not to have a lot of roommates or brothers or sisters. It was desirable to live out on your own. And it was considered a kind of a sign of affluence or success. I grew up, as many of you did, sharing a bedroom with a brother. And we had sisters who also shared a room, and that was considered normal back in the baby boom years. Everybody wanted to have their own room. Terrific. And then eventually, as children got older, they'd move out, and it became easier to get your own room. That's what happened to me. But it is not happening quite that way right now in the rest of the United States. And by the way, in the world. So in China in 2050, China is projected to have 60 million fewer people under the age of 15. Now, what that means is any kind of pediatric market that is within China by 2050 is going to all but disappear. That's going to be a big problem. 60 million fewer. All right, well, we know about the one-child policy and just the general reticence they've had to have more children, even though it has become legal. It's a loss of about a population the size of Italy. That's how significant that loss is going to be. And believe me, China already knows it right now. And that's one reason why they changed the policy toward having a one-child-only household. The ratios of retiring to working people is expected to triple by then. Now, here's the problem in China. And by the way, don't think that we're going to escape this. With fewer people working that have to support an ever-rising number of retirees, the economy is going to go through a significant struggle. And I can tell you that looking at the statistics around the United States, places like Vermont and Massachusetts are likely to also experience this, but it isn't just a few isolated states and locations in the United States. But going back, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore face very similar trends. In a perfect world, you have a population of 2.1 children per woman to maintain a stable population. And some people say, get rid of them. We've got too many people. We've got to decrease the surplus population, as Ebenezer Scrooge said. The problem is your economy is running on the young, on what they can produce and care for the elderly. Remember, a lot of these countries don't have the safety net that the West has, like in Great Britain, Western Europe, and the United States. So there is not some social safety net that's going to pay Social Security to these people. You've got to depend upon your descendants. In Japan, 40% of the entire population is expected to live alone by 2040. Now, this article that came out about what's going on in Japan made American demographers say, how are we doing as far as living alone and what implications is it going to have for our economy? And I extrapolate it's going to have impact in the United States, but it's also going to have real big implications on healthcare in the country. We'll talk about that as we go. Now, since 1960, people living alone in the U.S. has grown from 12% to 28%. That's more than double, obviously. You may think, well, how big a deal is that? Well, I can tell you, this is in my lifetime that people living alone has skyrocketed, and it's affecting the quality of life, the economy, work. And as people begin to recognize, look, there aren't as many workers as there used to be. We need more immigrants. Bring them in. Except a lot of these people are very, very poor and have very few skills. So they're not adding anything to the economy, at least until they try to get up to speed. Now, it means that far fewer homes with multiple residents, fewer in-family referrals, and almost no extended family referrals and households are going to be dominated by a single age group. It just means that the city that you live in may have everybody living very much closer to a single age category than ever. So most practices will divide themselves based on age. They'll be a geriatric or a pediatric or somewhere in between practice. But that is going to become a narrower and narrower range over time. Divorced, single-parent homes with fewer resources are going to become the norm. So you have a parent and you have a child, and that child may be shared between two divorced adults, and that is going to significantly impact things. Now, so far, it's been great because the kid has two sources of income, a mom and a dad who are working. And that's really good because you can put both of them on the hook to pay the fees. Yeah, but there are some other factors that you have to keep in mind, and that's what I want to talk about. There is a thing they call the 4-2-1 family in America, and it seems to be inevitable. And what it refers to is 4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 child. There are no uncles, aunts, cousins, brothers, sisters. That's it. And everything gets focused on the 1 kid. Well, that's psychologically a little odd because children don't learn to share. Parents put a huge amount of pressure on that 1 kid to be everything that they've always wanted. And if that 1 kid doesn't quite turn out to be everything they've wanted, doesn't want to get married, doesn't want to reproduce, the parents and the grandparents in turn kind of get left behind. And that is fueling a lot of problems for people. In 2021, there were 300,000 to 500,000 fewer births in the U.S., according to the Brookings Institute for COVID or from COVID. Now, in essence, what it means is people in the U.S. aren't reproducing. I frankly thought there would be more of a baby boom, and I was correct, but it's not universal. It's not ubiquitous. There are parts of the country where the birth rate is actually going up. There are parts of the U.S. that it's going down and dramatically. Marriages have dropped to a 35-year low right now. Now, marriage in itself, some people go, it's an old-fashioned institution. But remember, marriages are where 2 people stay together for a long period of time. They have longevity. They support each other as they age. And I can tell you something, my wife and I are increasingly dependent on each other. But if you don't have that support, you have to pay for someone else to drive you places, to bring you meals, to care for you. And that's putting a strain on our society and is likely to do even more as the economy becomes more perilous. Now, living alone, as I said, is not ubiquitous. Some states have a slight increase in the population per household. That happens, for instance, in the Central Valley in California, Kern County, Bakersfield, Visalia, up to Fresno, they have a slight increase in the population per household. That's largely caused by their social backgrounds, their nations of origin. Now, in Utah, including North Dakota, Vermont, and Maine, we have 3.8 persons per household. In these states, it's 2.8. What is unusual is how different those numbers are. 3.8 and 2.28 is a world of difference. When you start talking about the voting patterns in the next 10 years, you already know some states are losing voting districts and some are gaining. Texas will gain 2, Florida 1 or 2. But California and New York are losing the congressional districts. In the 10 years after that, it may, well, let's just say this, demographers are predicting some pretty significant political earthquakes because of this. Now, in Hispanic households, they have 3.22 people per household. So obviously states like California and Texas that have a large Hispanic population are doing a little better, or at least those parts of the state that have a significant Hispanic population. Parts of California have very few, but most of Texas has a larger than average number of Hispanics. But most of California and New York have dropped below the 2.3 person average, or on average. What that means is if you are serving those locations as a practice, you can't depend upon getting in-person referrals from people who live in your household or who live near you. In essence, the referral base is dropping, and it's dropping significantly. Now, the implications on living alone on healthcare, that's what we're going to talk about very specifically. Non-household members, family members, may increasingly have a say in treatment options. Now, remember, in the typical family or household, husband and wife, married, children, living with their natural parents, usually the parents had control over what treatments were received and who paid for what, and that was more normal. But what's happening increasingly is people who are not family members, non-household members, are having a say in what procedures are received. Now, keep in mind, with marriage becoming rarer, there is no legal precedent for a person simply to say, well, we're together, unless you have a common law marriage, which has been recognized by the state. When that happens, no problem. You don't even have to formalize your relationship with a wedding. However, it becomes more and more of a problem as the length of time that people are together shrinks. So if people are together for 3 to 5 years, you may not think much of that, but it's going to affect your practice and the natural legal obligations that people have in approving or funding healthcare procedures, particularly if they're very significant. Now, getting a ride to and from the office was no big deal. Everybody just said, well, I'll take you to the office. But getting a ride back and forth, it may become more and more difficult. Now, it is true that healthcare facilities, assisted living may actually have healthcare providers come in for exams or may provide transportation to healthcare facilities. That's at the best of all worlds. But increasingly, from what we found anecdotally, these extended care facilities are saying they don't want the liability of having to transport their residents. COVID has taught us that they're on the hook for a lot of stuff and they don't want to be criminally liable. So they're simply saying, well, it's not really a convenient thing for us to do. And besides, if you want it, you got to pay for it. DNRs, or, do not resuscitate, and other legal documents must be obtained and formalized from non-family members. When you have a spouse or a parent, child, DNRs were obviously decided by family members. But when people are not formally or officially family members, they're non-family members, getting the approvals, particularly when there is some suspicion that a person may not be capable of making that decision, is becoming problematic. Now, is that going to have a big impact upon healthcare? I believe increasingly it will, particularly on hospitals. Payment responsibilities are not exclusive to family members and may become less so. So let's say you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, you happen to be in advanced years. Are they going to take on your legal debts? Now, my sister, who is in her 70s, has said finding a nurse with a purse to marry is not quite as desirable as it used to be. A lot of nurses are saying, no, I'm not going to marry you. No, I'm not going to make myself responsible for your debts, your health care, your life. And so the responsibility for payment is becoming more and more of a burden based upon trusts and insurance. And if people aren't in the position where they have provided for their insurance or for their financial care in old age, it's going to become a bigger issue. Credit is becoming much more complicated as households become smaller. And as people become older and live alone, who's going to provide the credit? Who's going to back it up? Now, relationships may become more temporary and or shorter term or shorter duration. So what I'm saying is, if people decide not to marry, not to form a household, they have no blood relations. Relationships may become more professional, as in a nursing home or extended care facility, but also there's just not that many people to pick up the tab or help make the big decisions of healthcare. Who has to do this? Well, doctors, you do. Now, we're not talking about necessarily life-threatening cases of cancer. Let's talk about having dental care or even pet care. Who gets custody of Fluffy the dog after you've been together for 5 years and Fluffy's getting kind of old? Who's going to pay for the euthanasia? Who's going to pay for kenneling or end-of-life services? Yeah, it becomes more and more of a complication. Multi-generational agreements may rise in importance. So previously we looked at husbands and wives taking care of, these things, but multi-generation, children taking care of parents, well, that's in theory what's going to happen. Now, some people have said, oh, sure, the kids will take care of mom and dad, except as fewer and fewer children are produced by a marriage, it becomes more and more of a burden on fewer and fewer people. This is the same situation that's happening in Asia, where they don't have siblings to take care of, and the state is not in a position to care for their health care, especially if it's significant in cost. It has to come out of pocket. Do I have the answers? I do not, but I simply know that in some places this is a bigger issue than in others. And when the median household becomes older, it is particularly scary. So as the population ages, as relationships continue on, but people are of an older year and they're not together as long, well, look, the implications of living alone on healthcare becomes a bigger and bigger deal. Now, as I said before, I don't necessarily think I've got all the answers. In fact, I can tell you I do not. But I can say with some confidence that doctors, you're going to have to recognize the market that you are occupying, the place that you are, has a specific profile or disposition of people living alone and living into old age. It's necessary for you in the planning for your practice to consider the distribution of age, how you're soliciting patients, how those patients are sharing their legal documents like DNRs and the guarantees to pay for doctors. And it's a big deal. I have a large family and we have a very close extended family. And I think this may sound kind of weird, but we represent a good risk for doctors to take on us as patients. Some people are not going to become quite so desirable, particularly if their health becomes, more problematic, expenses rise, there are fewer people to carry the credit, transportation issues become more and more difficult, and people may assume that doctors are going to be the ones who are going to pick up the tab on this. I don't. In fact, wise doctors are going to have to really say right now what their strategies and their tactics are going to be about maintaining their relationships with an ever-aging and lonely lifestyle. And I mean by that lonely, living alone. I want to thank you for sticking around, and please tell your friends and neighbors about this. And also, it really helps us if you share these little videos or let people know that they have them available at drdemographics.com. This is Scott McDonald, and thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.